I want to show you some theories and practice, basically understanding terminology so that you can really have a good foundation for the future discussions. We have to start with Sigmund Freud. So he really started our modern understanding of a lot of things, including sexuality. A lot of people don't know that he did write a lot on the subject. He is roundly criticized for a lot of things that he said, but he wrote a series of papers that was then later published in 1963, and of course this is long after his death, but Sexuality and the Psychology of Love. And it's a bunch of his papers, and it's through the lens of dominant patriarchy and his conception of neuroses. And he attempted to describe sexual morality and modern nervousness, how men make love object choices, so who they're likely to fall in love with and how that plays out in the psychology of men, the taboo of virginity, and talking about what he believed that men naturally preferred a virgin, origins of sexual perversions. So he believed that he figured out what sexual perversions were and where they come from, and possible explanation for homosexuality in women. Of course, this was based on a case study. And he wrote a paper on female sexuality and so much more. So let's all look at him as a product of his time. Who's this? We've got Alfred Kinsey. He is an American biologist and professor of entomology and zoology turned sexologist. So he published Sexuality in the Human Male, which was called the Kinsey Report, and also Sexuality in the Human Female later on, 5 years later, which was also the Kinsey Report. He developed something called the Kinsey Scale, which is an interesting theory about sexuality and the way to look at people's sexuality, which is something that had never really been studied before in the way that Kinsey studied it. He also founded the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction at Indiana University in 1947. A movie was made attempting to tell the story of Alfred Kinsey in 2004, with Liam Neeson playing Kinsey. But I'm going to show you the trailer to that movie because it's so interesting.
I'm Dr. Alfred Kinsey from Indiana University, and I'm making a study of sex behavior. What's your most common decision?
There's more than one?
I've learned that the gap between what we assume people do sexually and what they actually do is enormous.
How young were you when you first experienced hugging?
Necking.
Petting?
What did you dream about?
That's why a study of this kind is so important. All we have is what people like you are willing to share with us.
Does suppressing
2 or 3 times.
No, only once.
A day. I think about my cat.
lead to stuttering?
A lot.
So, if you're sitting comfortably there, let's begin. In an uninhibited society, a 12-year-old would know most of the biology which I'll have to give you in formal lectures.
Dr. Kinsey's findings are shocking.
Are you surprised at the success of your book?
No, it shows that the world has wanted this done.
And Dr. Kinsey. Here, here, here.
Hoover is still annoyed that you won't help him find homosexuals in the State Department.
It's advisable to stick to what's normal. You don't want to shake people up.
Of course not.
What did you expect?
The enforcers of chastity are massing once again.
What are we to you? Just lab rats? Is this just another part of the project?
Stop using science to justify what you've done.
Forgive me, Meg. I've taken on so many other people's secrets. I don't want any of my own.
Haven't I always been open to whatever you wanted?
Sex is a risky game because if you're not careful, it will cut you wide open. You saved my life, sir.
just told me your entire history, but there hasn't been a single mention of love.
Love is the answer, isn't it? But sex raises a lot of very interesting questions.
We were all very excited in the sexuality education field when it came out. But, something that is very important to understand about Kinsey is that he was doing this at a time when sex was just not discussed, especially not publicly. And I think right now our society is opening up to talk about this stuff more than it ever has before. So Kinsey, he used personal interviews during which subjects would give their subjective report to a structured questionnaire as his primary method of data collection. So, you saw, Liam Neeson sitting there as Kinsey with his clipboard, and a smile and a pen, and then he would ask his questions and then take notes off of the discussions that ensued. So, for example, over 6,000 women were interviewed prior to publishing the Kinsey Report on Women. So, he did do a lot of investigation, and he did it from his entomology point of view. He was a rigorous scientist, and he really did apply that to getting as much information about human sexual behavior as he could, as much as the behavior of the insects that he studied. He did face criticism for interviewing and keeping confidential identities of possible child molesters in the interest of collecting information on taboo topics. It is one of the things that a lot of people look back on and say, should you have done that? What's your ethical obligation doing this research? Is the information you collect more important than possibly saving people from being victimized by somebody, or did somebody, tell you about a crime that they're committing, and is it something that you should have reported? His findings shed light on some things. Anal sex rates. So you got 11% of married couples that he interviewed saying that they engage in anal sex. And anal sex is something that even today our society thinks of as that's what gay men do. And that's not, something that heterosexual people really do. However, it's really not something also that gay men do as much as you might think. So, there's a study that said that only 25% of gay men couples engage in anal sex. It's just changing our perceptions, these assumptions that we have. Another one is bisexuality rates. Startlingly, 46% of males had engaged in homosexual activities in their lifetime at some point. So that's something, again, that cut against the grain. It cut against heterosexist culture that was out there. Ages of first sex, he found out what are the percentages of people and what do they report and when did they first start having sex. The average duration of sex. That's something that everybody wonders about. How long should people be having sex? Premarital and extramarital sex rates, including frequency and number of partners. So he gets all this detailed information about things like premarital sex at a time when nobody was supposed to be having premarital sex. Extramarital sex, come on, even today, people might hesitate to give that information, but he got it from people in these interviews. Common sexual positions that people used. Body image and erogenous zones and how people felt about these things. Frequency and types of fantasy, masturbation, and foreplay. Things of special notes that 11.6% of white males aged 20 to 25 were, here it is, seen as rated as being equally heterosexual and homosexual. So that shocked the public. Like half of these young white men, or sorry, not half, but 10%, a little over 10%. And then 12% of females and 22% of males were aroused by sadomasochistic story. So, 11% of males in marriage engaged in anal sex. Again, I mentioned that before, but that was shocking. Just really shocking to, 40s America. So, Kinsey, let me just move this over here. He developed something called the Kinsey scale. He sees people on a scale, or he would rate people on a scale. And that's a scale that runs from exclusively heterosexual all the way down to exclusively homosexual. But, you know, he's got all these ratings in between. Predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual. Predominantly heterosexual, but more than incidentally homosexual. And then equally heterosexual and homosexual. So that would be someone that might be considered bisexual by today's standards, or, you know, by the language that we tend to use or want to use. But, you know, most people use 0, 3, and 6. And only recently did the Kinsey Institute add the last one, the X one, which is asexual. So they believe that some people really are not sexual at all. So they just added that to the scale. Of course, the Kinsey Institute is still going today. I've been there, I've seen it. There's people that are working there. They have quite an archive. You wouldn't believe the papers and books and the collection that they have there. And they continue to do research out of the Kinsey Institute. William H. Masters and Virginia E. Johnson, Washington University in St. Louis. And they were all about the human body and physiology of sex, sexual response, and sexual function and dysfunction. So they were investigating the bodily experience of sex and the practice. Really fascinating. So I'm going to show you another video, and this is about Masters and Johnson. It's just, this is Masters of Sex.
In the straight-laced 1950s, conducting research into sex presented some daunting challenges. For example, when Masters and Johnson began their work at Washington University in 1957, they wondered where they would find volunteers for the project. But to their surprise, they discovered that many ordinary people were willing to serve as subjects.
Curiously enough, getting research subjects was easy. If you had to wade through the fraternities that sent their pledges in to be interviewed, and, you know, the poor dears were stammering, stuttering, and so on, because they didn't come of their own free will. And that was very easy to screen out, of course, and kind of fun in a way.
So, Masters and Johnson embarked on the first major scientific study of sexual response ever conducted. Masters and Johnson have since destroyed the films they made of their early studies, but later researchers repeated their work, including films such as these. Over a 10-year period, Masters and Johnson observed and took measurements from 700 male and female subjects masturbating or having intercourse in the laboratory. They once estimated they had studied over 10,000 orgasms. They were the first to film a woman's orgasm internally using an artificial penis of clear plastic that contained a light and camera. In the late 50s and early 60s, this kind of research would have scandalized many if they had known it was going on.
I couldn't think of any way that I could prepare the public for the shock value of finding out that such research existed.
They were superbly courageous of doing something against the stream of society and to delve into some kind of study about a taboo topic, something between the waist and the knees. And not only did they study it, they observed it.
So from the beginning, Masters knew it was imperative that the research be conducted in relative secrecy. And he was very careful to shield the project from outside criticism by lining up support from the university and from local clergy. In 1964, Masters moved the project off campus, establishing the Reproductive Biology Research Foundation. It was financed by a few private donations and small foundation grants. Masters himself took no pay from the foundation or the medical school, supporting himself solely from his gynecological practice. Masters and Johnson attempted to report their findings to the medical community, but the most prestigious journals rejected their research papers. By 1966, though, after 12 years of work, Masters and Johnson were ready to publish their research in book form. At the time, America's attitudes about sex were becoming more liberal, but little new information had become public.
In the mid-1960s, we knew more about how to get a man to the moon and back than we knew about what was happening inside the vagina of a sexually stimulated woman.
Even in the mid-1960s, some people thought anything related to sex was pornographic. Masters and Johnson knew that, so when they brought out their book, Human Sexual Response, they did everything they could to control the potential for sensationalism.
Does it concern you that thrill seekers, people of that sort, will make it a point to try to get a copy of your study?
No, I don't really think so. If they are looking for pornography or that type of material, they're going to be disappointed, because I can assure you that every effort was made to remove this type of material from the text.
Masters and Johnson wrote the book as a medical textbook in deliberately dense scientific language. They chose a conservative Boston publisher, Little Brown, and held briefings for small groups of science writers in a Boston hotel suite just before publication.
We weren't marketing. We just didn't want the books burned. We just didn't want them to be ignored for what they were or misunderstood.
The book was a sensation. Little Brown released 15,000 copies, and they sold out in one day.
How has the demand been running?
Wonderful. Beyond our fondest expectations.
I noticed you put it in the window, so you have no...
It's a hot property. I want to sell it.
Human Sexual Response went on to sell over 250,000 copies in just the first year. It held firm on the bestseller list for 6 months.
Do people apologize for ordering it or try to pass themselves off as students or anything?
On the contrary. I mean, this is an enlightened age, and people are interested in sex.
Compared to the 1950s, it was an enlightened age, as America's sexual mores were changing.
If the Masters and Johnson book had arrived in 55 or 1960, it would have been blasted. It arrived at almost the perfect time. It arrived at a time in which people were throwing off a lot of the taboos and repression related to their own sexuality.
In Human Sexual Response, Masters and Johnson identified 4 phases of orgasm and detailed the physiological responses in each. Some of their findings overturned popular misconceptions, particularly in regard to female sexuality. The book publicized the ability of many women to have multiple orgasms, and it showed that physiologically, a woman's orgasm was the same, no matter what the stimulation. This overturned Sigmund Freud's notion that there were vaginal orgasms from intercourse, which were proper and mature, and clitoral orgasms, which were neurotic and immature.
And this notion that there were 2 kinds of orgasms and one was superior, psychologically, emotionally, to the other, was very much prevalent in the culture at the time. But Masters and Johnson's work, what they said essentially is that an orgasm is an orgasm, however achieved. What it did is it gave women a sense of both entitlement and a sense of inclination to pursue it, so that women became much more eager to achieve and experience orgasm.
Human Sexual Response became a bestseller, but not everyone was thrilled with an explicit textbook about sex.
The book was published on a Monday, and by Friday the mail began coming in sacks. I mean that literally. We had to employ 3 secretaries on a part-time basis to answer the mail. About 80% of the mail was dropped dead.
Previously, Dr. Masters had received numerous
this time it was a gynecologist, Masters and Johnson, doctors. They were kind of taking a medical view of this. And also to remember that Kinsey came just before them and what they were trying to publish. And when Kinsey published his Kinsey report on male sexuality, it was very well received. Then 5 years later, when he published the female sexuality, there was a lot of pushback on that one. And I think this is something, again, that we're going to have to really analyze. Is why was there so much more pushback on the female sexuality report than the male sexuality report for Kinsey? And then why, when Masters and Johnson's first attempt to publish, why was that avoided? And those two things kind of corresponded timeline-wise. And then it wasn't until the 60s, the mid-60s, where Masters and Johnson published the book on their own, bringing attention to this issue, and then becoming more accepted as a legitimate source of information on sexuality. Let's talk about terminology. So, sex defined. So this comes from a descriptive dictionary and atlas of sexology, published in 1991. So, sex character, any structural, behavioral, or functional trait typically found more often in one sex. Also, those visible body features associated with sexual status and reproductive role of a male or a female, classified as primary, secondary, and tertiary. So, primary sex characteristics, physical attributes which develop based on chromosomal, scripted, sex, fundamental biology of reproductive systems, like males include testes, penis, females, ovaries, vulva, vagina. Okay, so those are primary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics, physical attributes which develop during puberty, which allows for the reproductive functioning of the sex organs. So males start growth of pubic hair, sperm production. Females start growth of pubic hair and menstruation, so they experience menarche. And then there's tertiary sex characteristics. And those are differences associated with sex that are in large part acquired of learned, the adoption of masculine and feminine sex roles based on sex role stereotypes within a culture, separate from primary and secondary due to non-biological basis. So these are things that are very mutable from culture to culture, from society to society, from time to time, age to age. So, sex identity is one's internalized conviction of his or her own sex as a male or female. Sexual identity is often used as a synonym for gender identity. So, like I said, there are people who are born and they feel that their body is the wrong sex. And so this is a conflict of one's biological state and one's internalized state. So this is something that someone might consider a sex change or not, depending. Sex attribution is the interpretation of one's outward physical appearance and assumption of sex or reproductive status by others. Sexual orientation is a pattern of sexual attraction based on the eternal sex of one's partner. So, heterosexual is the opposite sex, homosexual is the same sex, and bisexual, both the same and the opposite sex. So I think it's interesting how they define sexual orientation here. You think about the Kinsey scale, that's that 0, 3, and 6 attributions. But here they say a pattern of sexual attraction. And that kind of accounts for people having experiences that, can't be used to define them. They just do something and maybe exploring, maybe questioning. There's got to be a lot of room for avoiding labels with sexual orientation. Next, intersex, often called hermaphrodites. One uncertain reproductive status, includes a wide variety of combinations of internal and external sex characteristics. And then there's transsexual, one who does not identify with their biological sex and often has surgery to restructure the physical sex to one which they identify with. So here's gender. Gender is one's personal, social, and or legal status as a man, woman, or transgendered. One's social role as a sexual person, linked with the sex of the person. Male equals man, female equals woman. Intersex are often assigned, sometimes, now I have to tell you that I work under a New York State Health Department grant. And we provide medical services and educational services to a variety of people. And one of the things that has recently changed is that we are now tracking, as part of our paperwork, transgendered people and intersex people. So it's just something that we're now paying attention to. And it's not that we're tracking those people for any bad reasons. It's because we've now come as a society to recognize this is a population of people and that they need the same access to services and attention that anybody else would need. And so tracking them and the education that we give and the services that we provide is a way for us to find gaps in service and make changes. So this is definitely a very good trend to the positive. Gender assignment, cultural and or family decisions, whether a child will be raised as a boy or a girl. Gender role, learned rules or guides within a culture for each gender to follow, labeled as masculine or feminine, roles that are linked to one's sex or reproductive functioning. Gender identity is one's internal conviction of his or her own gender status as a man, woman, or transgendered. Gender dysphoria is gender assigned but goes against the sense of gender identity. This can lead to gender reassignment. So that's just sort of a different word on something that we already covered. So gender reassignment can be imposed based on biological sex makeup or a choice due to conflicting gender identity. Gender attribution, the interpretation of one's physical appearance and what gender role symbols project to others. There's a lot of people who sort of start the sex change process and they're pre-surgical, hormonal, and they don't end up doing surgery. They kind of find a place somewhere in between that they're comfortable with, or they just don't want to take the jump and it causes a lot of anxiety. Gender reassignment surgery is a long and painful process, and it's not something that you can turn around and go back from very easily. So, sometimes it's people's comfort and sometimes it's people's anxieties and fears about what comes next and being unsure. But we have to have complete and total patience with people's process on that because it's their bodies, it's their identity, and they're trying to find their peace. Finally, gender orientation is a more general, less genitally focused term for what has been traditionally labeled sexual orientation. It includes a person's erotic sexual orientation, the gender orientation of their sexual fantasies, and their affectional or romantic orientation. So, again, there's so many definitions and there's so many terms, and I'm going to tell you that none of them are concrete. They're constantly changing. For instance, there's the word gay, we've all heard, and for some people gay just means homosexual. For other people gay means just men, gay men, and there's a different term for homosexual women. The word queer, which, for me growing up, the word queer was derogatory, and I still have a little something going on when I say the word. But now it's a word that's been reclaimed, and queer is something that is preferred in, what could be framed LGBTQ communities. So instead of all those letters and all those more concrete definitions, a more general, loose term of queer just kind of covers everybody and says, hey, I'm not something that you can pin down. Transgender is a person who enacts the social role of the other gender to which their sex is commonly linked. And this person may or may not view themselves as belonging to another sex. So a stereotypical thing of that is the crossdresser. So men who dress like women, drag queens, and such. So a lot of people assume that this has something to do with their sexual orientation, and it doesn't. It may be that they see themselves as a woman, and that's not necessarily true. It could be or it could not be. You know, it totally depends. But you don't have to be transgender to do these things. So androgynous, one who does not fit into the gender rules of specific gender. Transvestite, there we go from transgender, one who enjoys dressing in the clothes of the opposite gender, thus the opposite sex, often in relation to sexual arousal, attainment of orgasm, and to receive the attention given to those of the opposite gender role. So that's usually a lifelong behavior pattern, rarely leads to transsexualism. But, you know, it's interesting. Don't expect to understand if it's not something that you do or are into. You just have to accept that this is the way some people are, and that's what they like, and that's what they want. And there's no reason they shouldn't have that. Drag queens and kings, another type of transvestite, are homosexual who adopt elaborate feminine, masculine personas, garb, mannerisms as part of camp culture. Female impersonators are professional entertainers who may or may not be homosexual. In strict sense, both are excluded from transvestitism due to being described as, episodal, total transposition of gender identities. There's also these terms you've heard: she-male, he-female. So a she-male is considered one who is biologically male and has gender identity of a man, but wishes some of the physical attributes of a woman. May surgically implant and or alter his or her body to be able to be gender attributed as a woman, separate from transsexual due to sexual identity consistent with own biological sex. And then he-female's the other side of it, is also called gender-bending women, broadly defined as biological females who prefer the physical and or behavioral aspects of men. More socially acceptable than she-males because it is natural for women who are culturally inferior to want to be a man who are culturally superior. Of course, that is quite the dated concept. So we covered Freud, we covered Kinsey, we covered Masters and Johnson, and then a lot of different words and terms. This is the end of this presentation.